Hello, I'm Joan. I'm a Canadian family physician who also works as a restorative medical educator, facilitator, and coach. I create spaces that rehumanize the work of healthcare. I'm creating this podcast to remind myself, as well as anyone else working in a helping profession, that when you are working and caring for your human patients, you are the other human in the room. Hey, healthcare human. How often do you feel overcapacity, forgetting basic bodily needs, or feeling disconnected from your passion for healthcare? You're not alone, and there's nothing wrong with you. Our system encourages overworking, leading to burnout, mistakes, and drained empathy. But what if you could be the change you need? Imagine a workflow that honors your natural pace, a schedule with space for rest and pleasure, and a life where you get to express your full humanity. I've helped many clinicians create this space, and I'd love to help you in my coaching program, Creating Space. Creating Space is a restorative coaching experience designed specifically for overworked healthcare professionals like you. Join me and an intimate group of fellow healthcare humans on a transformative 7-month journey. Together, you'll learn the tools needed to reclaim your humanity, receive both group and individual support to navigate obstacles, and celebrate your efforts with a luxurious in-person spa retreat at the end. I only run this program once a year from October to April, and it is the only way to work with me privately. I am having so much fun with the current group of healthcare humans in Creating Space that I've decided to open early bird registration for the cohort starting this fall. From March 1st to 31st, you can claim your spot in the group and get the added benefit of access to a 12-month payment plan, as well as a bonus one-on-one coaching session with me anytime between now and when the program starts. These extra bonuses are only available if you register before April. So, if you're ready to take the first step towards a more spacious and satisfying life, go to joanchanmd.com/space and book your call with me. We'll have the chance to connect, get all your questions answered, and start planning how to create space in your life for you. Hello there, healthcare humans. Thank you so much for coming back for another episode of The Other Human in the Room. So today, I have a topic that has been on my mind a bunch, especially in this past year, and that is transition planning. I don't know how often you think about this topic, but for me, especially in the past few years, as I've been making changes to my life and how my work looks in order to explore new avenues, explore new kinds of income, like I talked about last week, as well as just like exploring ways to feel more human in my life and in my work. A part of that has been doing a lot of different transitions, leaving one position for another, transitioning how I'm working. And I have learned the hard way about transitions. And certainly I've experienced what it's like when I don't do much transition planning and don't really think it through versus times when I've done a ton of transition planning and thought it through. And I prefer doing some planning. Sometimes planning can be actually just like a way to worry and to ruminate about the future and think that you have certainty of its outcome by planning a lot in the present. So I'm not suggesting that you use planning for that purpose. But when it comes to transitioning anything in your life where like something's going to be a big change, having a bit of forethought, preparing your mind and your body and your schedule for the fact that things are about to change can be really, really helpful. So I first wanted to like reflect back on sometimes I had transitions in my life and like how they went. So I'd say like the first major transition I had in my life is when I moved away to university. I went to university in a city that was maybe, how far away is Hamilton from Kingston? I forget how long the drive was now. So she had to drive through Toronto. So that made it longer. So it was, I think it was like 7 or 8 hours because of the traffic sometimes. So doing that, I honestly was wholly unprepared. I just had no idea what it was going to be like living away from home for the first time, as well as I didn't know I was about to walk into an unintended faith transition out of my religion, like having like an existential identity and spiritual crisis all at the same time. So I would say that was my absolute worst transition. I experienced, I think looking back, at least mild depression by my second year. Like, that was a real smack in the face and a way of transitioning where I had no idea what I was going into. I was not prepared. Not only no one prepared me, but I didn't even know to try and prepare myself. And I think that experience, looking back, I don't want to experience that again. So I'm going to do my best in future transitions to not have that happen. Having said that, I also had another big transition, which was transitioning to practice. So yeah, of course there was adjustments when I went to medical school and residency, but I feel like I was in student mode for all of those, and I kind of knew what like adult learner mode looked like, even if I was in a new location. And so those could be stressful, and there was like an adjustment curve, but I had a sense of like what I needed to get by. But then suddenly, like completely graduating residency and now launching into practice, the one thing that I did, which is very, very common, and actually again speaks to what I talked about last week, like the whole creating financial space thing, was taking on too much. So I started my medical career as a locum, which if you don't know what a locum is, that's like a substitute doctor. And so I locumed at a bunch of different clinics, and I thought that when you were locuming, obviously you should work, 5 days a week, 8+ hours a day, because that's as much time there was and that's as much need there was. And sure, then it helped financially too. But honestly, for me, it was more just like, that's what you should do. And if you were only working but at the time I was thinking only working 3 days a week, like you were wasting your time, like you're supposed to be working harder than that. And so I took on way too much. It culminated in this time I took on a mat leave where I was working for the mat leave for, however long, 6-8 months, and then 4 days a week, plus a completely different practice 1 day a week. And that was like my first taste of what burnout felt like, I think. And, that was terrible and yes, unwelcome. And again, I hadn't thought through my capacity. I hadn't thought through what I even wanted. I was just sort of on the hamster wheel, trying things out. And I'm not like, beating up my past self. I understand completely why I did it. It certainly was a lesson that I'm going to learn from now, and I wouldn't wish to repeat it or recommend it for someone else. Same with starting my own practice. I thought that finally everything would be better once I got my own practice, because I had the sense of like, the problem is I'm in other people's practices. I don't have as much autonomy. I'm kind of, trying to please this other person I'm working for, even though they're at home with a baby. And when I finally have my own practice, then everything will be better. Guess what happened? Can you guess? So actually what happened was, oh no, this is my own practice. Now all these patients are just mine, and I have to try and meet the needs. I want to be a good doctor. I want to work as hard as I can to always have great availability. And, I'm going to go above and beyond. I'm going to do the home visits. I'm going to do the special calls after work. I'm going to try and get my paperwork done, et cetera, et cetera. And, did not think about my capacity, totally thought about the needs. And in some ways my life could fit that because I was married, but we didn't have any kids, and I just didn't have much of a life outside of work, honestly. Like I didn't have a ton of hobbies or outside responsibilities or obligations that I would have said were better than this. So, could stay until 7 or 8 at the office finishing my charting, and then maybe do some more when I got home. And the only consequence is I didn't see my husband, and he was traveling a lot for work at the time. So it was just like, this is the only thing in my life. Why can't it take on way too much of my life? Even then though, a year into that, I thought, okay, how do I sustain this? The demand keeps going up. I thought, if I was so kind and caring, that would like settle people down. But no, now some of these patients, every time I give a ton, they like demand more. Uh-oh, what do I do? Right? So that transition, again, not thinking through, how do I play the long game with this? How can I make this a sustainable kind of practice? In a lot of ways, I set myself up with habits that then I had to break later, which is fine. And I wonder, so say you're newer in your practice or you're about to start a job in a new position. What would happen if you really joined and started from this premise of like thinking through the planning and considering yourself, your capacity, what you enjoy as you set yourself up? That's what we're doing here on this podcast today. Okay. Couple more transitions I thought of, and something I thought might be relevant to those of you listening is, because I think people, when they think transition plan, they only think about leaving. So like planning to retire from practice or planning to transition from outpatient to GP psychotherapy or to hospitalist. And like, I have not experienced those yet, but I have experienced 2 maternity leaves. And that is its own kind of transition because you're transitioning out to something you're going to transition back into. And a couple nuggets from those. The main being that, like, when I got back, I'd always expect myself to work equally as much as I was before while pumping, while doing other things. After my second mat leave, I also added in being like the MD lead of our vaccine clinic and still being a part of like 3 different boards and 2 different advisory committees, doing tons of Zoom meetings while pumping in the middle of the pandemic. That was a lot. And so, shocking to no one, that was after that second mat leave, though in some ways it was thrilling. And I actually still have a lot of pleasant and happy memories from like some of the things I was doing. By the summer of that year, had less happy memories and was more angry and resentful and overwhelmed and shame-filled, aka burnt out, right? So transition planning is a time where you're really at risk of burnout because you're trying to get rid of and take off the plate of one thing while transitioning to a new thing. If you're not careful, suddenly you can be doing 2 things at once. Also, there's a lot that you have to process, like emotionally, mentally, logistically, that if we don't have more space for, suddenly now your task list is overflowing. And we just know, like, that's why residency and different kind of learning environments, you're at higher risk of burnout. A piece of that is that you're always transitioning. Like every 6 to 8 weeks, you're having to adjust to a new environment. And that takes more energy. That takes more of your mind and your body's space to be like, what am I doing now? Where do they keep the pens here? Right? So planning and understanding that transitions are a time that are challenging. That was actually my favorite mantra coming back from my first mat leave. I didn't have any sense about this creating space stuff. I didn't really have a full understanding about burnout, but a friend of mine who is a physician who also cares about wellness, I'm pretty sure she's the one who told me that fact about how like transitions are like put you at risk for burnout, and that's why residency is so hard. And I remember hearing that and thinking, okay, when I get back to work, I'm going to repeat to myself, transitions are hard. Transitions are hard. And you'd think, like in some ways it's like, oh, that was making you feel more negative, like you're only seeing what was hard. But for me, it was very validating of like, sort of no wonder you feel all these feelings. This is a transition. And so it was really validating for me to just tell myself, hey, this is hard because transitions are hard, not because you're broken, not because anything's going wrong. This is just what transitions feel like, That's probably what I would say now instead of transitions are hard. It's like, this is what transitions feel like. I had a patient recently ask me for advice about going back to work, and that's what I offered to her is like, transitions are hard. This is what transitions feel like. So giving yourself grace and space to know it's going to potentially have some bumps in the road, it makes it a lot smoother, ironically. You don't have to add your own bumps of self-criticism and thinking you're failing and all the things that are inhuman stories that we pick up along the way. So those are some examples of transitions I have experienced in the past. And after those transitions, especially that second one when I was so overwhelmed and really then, had my like road to Damascus moment of not getting my charts done and the inbox overflowing, that's when I joined the charting course, and the rest is history, found coaching, etc. It was around that time that I was on a board and we were talking about creating a transition plan for one of the leaders within the organization. And it was through him that I learned the phrase transition planning and like that's what that is, right? And also another word for it, you could say, is succession planning, especially if you're talking about someone in a leadership position. Like, can you do succession planning so that, kind of like you're succeeding the throne or whatever? I think that's where that comes from. So, and the notion from that world is that a good leader, a good CEO or board director or whatever, starts succession planning the day they take on the role. And I think that's a really fascinating idea. What if you, the day you started your job, were already pointing to for yourself and planning in some ways how it will be when you transition out of that job? Not in a way where you're like, I'm getting out of here any minute, but being like, I'm starting a thing that I'm hopeful for me with my practice. I'm hopeful I will have the same clinical practice until I retire. That's my current intention anyway. I'm not holding on to it too tight, but it's a bit of a romantic notion. I love being the idea of being married to one practice for that long, but if change happens, I'll let you know. And in the meantime, what if the day I started my like took over my practice, I was already thinking about my future self decades down the line about to retire and like set my future self up for success by some of the things I was putting in place now. I really love that idea. So I wanted to talk about why you might consider doing the same thing and starting to plan for a transition, even if you're not expecting it. We think about this in many areas of our life, right? Like people say, get a will, make sure you've had advanced care planning conversations with your loved ones, even if you have no reason to believe you're about to pass away or fall into a coma, because you just like never know. So there's some like thinking about the future stuff that we have some sense of. And so what if we included that in our workplace? And so here's some of the specific benefits I thought of to consider transition planning related to your work. So the first is that you actually will be more prepared whenever you transition. You'll know the steps required. You'll know the people to contact. You'll have given yourself the runway to do it at a pace that works for you. So, if you're living in like constant denial that you'll ever retire, and I don't know if you can think of anyone in your life that this fits that criteria for. I can think of some people I've worked with in the past where it's like, I'm not retiring. And then actually maybe then they're forced into retirement because of maybe their job performance has gone down because they've outlived, the time in which their job performance was be able to be sustained, or something happens suddenly and there's a sudden transition, or they finally look at it and then they want to retire next month or something, right? And that causes such more of a shock wave, not only for that person like themselves, but everyone else in that organization that they're working with, versus someone where it's like, in the next 5 years, I'm planning to retire, and how much space that would give you to set yourself up in little micro steps, make it way less overwhelming so that it can actually maybe even feel like a pleasant, positive experience versus how many people feel, which is like a really hard experience. Or at least it can be a mix of both, right? So maybe you think that's the only benefit. Obviously, if you plan for something, then you're more prepared for it. But I think there's some other benefits as well to consider. One is that if you have that mindset that like, I know that this isn't going to be my job forever. I know there's someone who eventually I'm going to ask to take over this practice. So you're not only doing things now for your future self, but also for your future replacement. That allows you to recognize that you only are playing a temporary role. Like, it's so funny. It's like, oh, I'm just a temp or whatever. Like, we're all just a temp in a way, in like the grand scheme of life. This job will not be my job. None of the jobs I hold will be my job forever, including the job of being like a living human being, in the sense that I will pass away at some point, right? And so if you know that you're in a temporary role, how does that help you not over attach to things that aren't serving you? How can you still show up with passion and delight and do great, deep, satisfying work, but not have this sense of it totally embedding in your sense of identity or in shoulds or shame stories that don't serve you? Like, I've been thinking a lot about when people say, oh, that person, they're an institution, and there's something that can be really beautiful about that. And if you identify as an institution, I no mean want to insult you. And if it feels like calm and beautiful and happy in your body, please continue. I am also reflecting on the idea that like when someone says that a particular employee in an organization is an institution, that has like technically dehumanized and depersonalized them, because an institution is like not a human thing, right? It's like, oh, you're going to be a building that'll always be here forever. What is that about, right? Like, why is that even a compliment? Why is that something we want people to be? And that doesn't mean you can't like stick around with something forever. Like I just said, I'm hoping to continue to practice within my practice, and my patients will change as they, age and are born. But like my hope is that I will continue to have the same practice for a whole time. Maybe that means that someday someone will be like, oh, that Dr. Chan, she's an institution here in Guelph because she's been around for so long. That's okay if they say that. But do I identify as that? Do I really hold on to that role as like, I am one of the family physicians at Acorn to Oak Family Medical, like, and that is who I am as a person, and in a fixed way? that can make transitioning out of it way harder. What if I learn to de-identify myself from my roles now, practice that now, and could that actually be a net benefit to how long I stay in the profession, my flexibility and openness to change, which is inevitable as we know? And can that really help set up my transition time to feel better for me as well as whoever's coming in, right? And then the last benefit I thought of was just this deeper appreciation of being a part of a team, of something larger, and working in a more interconnected and collaborative way. Just this idea that I know a lot of folks, I think in many industries and certainly in healthcare, can struggle with, where you feel like you're the only one who could ever do it as good. And patients can say that to me, like, oh, I only want to see you. You're the only one who gets me. And like, I am actively trying to dispel that idea so often. And it helps that I literally work in like an interconnected team with my nurse practitioner and medical learners, right? In my opinion, I don't want to say healthier because that's got its own like connotation and that can feel shamey, but like I have felt so much more human, so much more myself, so much lighter, and like felt like the work that I am able to offer to my patients, the care I offer is so much more powerful now that I don't think I'm the only person who could ever do it. The times I can feel so much gratitude to the folks that are on the team with me and saying, I am one of many, and together we will do our best to take care of you. And like saying that directly to the patients multiple times. When I also think about the fact that someone else who's on my team is the person that I will eventually pass the baton on to, amazing. And it makes me work in a different way now. So hopefully I've convinced you, or at least allowed you, the invitation to open your mind to transition planning now, even if you have no known transitions upcoming, could, I've given you enough of an argument that you'll consider it for the rest of this podcast. How about that? See, I was like softening the language from convincing. Listen, you have your own brain. You can think whatever you want, but you're listening to this podcast, so might as well try on the thoughts I'm offering you, right? So some examples of actually how I'm transitioning now. Like I said, I am not transitioning out of my clinical practice, but I am transitioning out of a teaching role that I've held through the university at which I'm a faculty of for 8 years. So I'm feeling like a micro, not even that micro, I'm feeling like a pretty solid version of this because I've realized like, it's okay. It's very natural. My brain has really identified myself as being very connected to this program. And I really love this program in so many ways. And I am so happy that I have decided to transition out of it because I was already starting to notice me enjoying it less. And I am firmly committed to the idea that you leave things before you hate them, love them and leave them, that kind of idea. And that is what I'm doing with this program. And so this transition planning podcast is as much for me as for anyone else. So I'm letting you know what I am doing, what I'm planning to do, what's worked for me. It's also on my mind a lot because other members of my practice, so I'm one of 6 physicians who all work together, other members of my practice are actually planning to retire soon. And by the way, if you're a family physician who wants to work in Guelph and wants to work with me, contact me because we would love to connect with people who are interested in taking over a practice within the year of 2025. So contact me, please, if you would like to work with me. Anyways, that was a little mini plug there. So for the rest of this podcast, I wanted to talk about the principles of transition planning that I think are important to keep in mind. And the most important thing before we jump into the principles is start now, and which of all the different things I'm about to list, start with whatever feels most accessible and most possible to begin with. Even simply, when you have a new decision to make about your business, about your practice, about your roles, about your workflow, how can you make them on behalf of your future self and your future replacement self more? That could be all you do for transition planning, and that is perfect. So certainly no shame-based stories of like, oh gosh, but I am planning to retire next year and I haven't started planning. Like now is a great time to start. And also, if you are not planning to do any transitioning out of your career for several decades, some of this stuff may not be as relevant to you, right? But some of it will be, and that's what's important. So listen with this idea of what's relevant to me, please, and what I'm about to share. Even if you do your best planning, of course, transitions are going to be bumpy. And the whole idea of why I'm sharing this with you, like I've already said, is though it will help and serve your future self if you plan now, it actually will help and serve yourself now too. Because the things that you can think of that will make your life easier in the future and make your, especially your replacements, your replacement easier in the future, that can be like a sneaky way to help yourself now. Because we have this really messed up shame-based thing where we like can't be kind to ourselves, but we can be kind to other people. So like if it gives you a little dodge to be like, someday my future replacement will really want to have breaks for lunch. So why don't I start establishing that as a routine now? Thumbs up. We'll take it. If that's the little dodge you're very socially conditioned against self-care needs, make it future replacements care and then get going. Sounds great. So those are sort of just the caveats before we get started. Everything I'm about to list, some will be more directly relevant if you're directly starting a very firm transition plan versus just a theoretical one, but there's something in here for everyone. So the 4 principles of transition planning, like the 4 areas to consider. The first is like knowledge and knowledge transfer. The second is logistics of the actual transition. The third is your emotional, spiritual identity work. And the fourth is practice. So I'm going to go through each of those in a little more detail. So the first one, knowledge transfer. This is the one that I'm actively working on now, knowing I'm transitioning out of my role, is I'm looking through all the different like documents I've made related to this teaching role and trying to collate them all into one document. I'm calling it my like handover document to whoever is going to replace me. I realized that, when I took on the role, a lot of it was just sort of verbal handover as well as sort of hodgepodge different papers. And that doesn't help me in my brain. I will forget things so fast. I'm a Google Docs gal myself, but whatever system you have, having some kind of system where you can, not necessarily in beautifully organized fashion, but ideally searchable fashion, can put information and then share it with the other person so that you don't have to remember and like constantly be saying things over to the other person. Incredibly helpful. So like passwords, EMR details, important people and their contact information, important dates. How much of this stuff already exists but isn't all in one place, or you don't know how to access it? Could other people, like your office manager or other staff that work for you, help you access it? But kind of getting it all in one folder in one place now, so that whenever someone needs it, it's already at their disposal. This can be really helpful to do even if you're not planning to leave your job soon, because you never know when, maybe you'll actually want to take an extended vacation or sabbatical, and then you'll already have the information you need to give over to the locum who might replace you, or, the replacement worker if you don't have locums, but you know what I mean? Also, people can have unplanned leaves. If you have a medical leave of some kind, right? Suddenly no one knows where you keep the keys. So what if you already ahead of time had at least an understanding, a post-it note, something that's got the core info, or at least where they can find the core info. A dark example is, I don't know about you, but I can think of a few physicians who have suddenly passed away, and, suddenly they're trying to figure out how, where they kept the passwords and stuff. That's, I say it's a dark example, but it's actually what made me think of this, is, a few years ago now, my dad suddenly sent us all an email, and it was titled like "For When I Die" or something. And it just had this like encrypted document with all the different passwords and where he keeps the servers. And he's a very techie guy. So like having something like that, it sounds morbid or silly maybe, but it's actually super helpful. And especially if you kind of are in the mindset of like helping future self, helping future replacement, as a new thing happens, then you don't have to go back and scrounge for it. You can get in the habit of putting all those things in one place on your computer, or putting all those things in like photocopying and putting them on one folder in your filing cabinet, right? And just like have it as a practice as things updated, where you're putting them. And so then you can direct your replacement, temporary or permanent replacement, to those things. Ideally, from the day you start it up, you find what systems work for you, and you like keep a document that lives outside your brain, and just to clear your working memory and then help that future transitions in the end. A version of this that's more about like workflow planning now, but leads into transition planning is like just the other day, my office manager and I created a Google Doc where we're going to like note trends throughout the year and things that we notice we're always saying to each other at certain times of year. Like I'm recording this early in the year, and it was a little while ago. It was January. In January, I think my memory is faulty, but that's why we're starting the Google Doc to see. It's like January is always slammed with patient care because everyone gets sick after the Christmas holidays and the winter holidays. And also a bunch of staff always get sick. And so it's always so crunchy. So it's not a time to take on like a new different project. It's a time to assume you're going to be rebooking a bunch and people are going to be in high demand. I just had a call clinic and I saw, the third more patients than I would see on a high busy day anyway. So anyway, that's like a document we've started to see if we can help keep a collective body of knowledge about something that happens every year. Like, is there a commonality and a flow to it? And so whenever she decides that she wants to share her role or move on, which I personally hope will be a very long time for now, but I will honor her decision whenever it is. And when I do the same, we'll like have these documents already available so we can simply share them and not have to keep it all in our brain. So that's the knowledge transfer one. So what kind of knowledge are you already like collecting about the like machinations and inner workings of your clinic? How could you be keeping them sort of in one place or in a method where it doesn't have to just live in your brain, it can live outside your brain and be more easily shared? Oh, one last example that I've never personally done, but I do think is brilliant. I heard from Sarah Smith, Dr. Sarah Smith, who does the Charting Champions, is like if you're training a staff how to do something, if you do it like online or in some way where you're screen recording the computer, so that when another person comes on and they're being trained on the same like computer process, they can simply watch the video instead of you having to tell them again how to do it. I just thought that was so smart. And I've never done it, but maybe someone of you will be smart enough to do it. So that's knowledge transfer. The second area to consider with transition planning is the logistics. So this one may seem obvious, but I think a lot of people, especially if they're sort of in denial that transitions need time and space and have extra tasks associated with them, may not consider it. So if you know there's a transition upcoming, you're pregnant and you know you're going off in the future, you're planning to retire, whatever it is, really gathering up. And for a lot of these common ones like mat leaves and retirement, their checklists may exist. I think they exist. Certainly there's checklists of what to consider when starting a practice. I certainly hope there's ones through like the family physician college about retiring as well. Like what paperwork needs to be signed to officially like sign you off from the insurance company, right? Like what experts will you need to hire, lawyers or accountants or like a coach to help you cope or whatever, but like, what experts would be helpful to hire. Also, like who else, like beyond experts, like mentors or people who have been through it, can you rely on and ask for advice and help with? Like that's such an important piece. And just again with the logistics, like, so say you get your checklist and you look at it and you're like, oh my gosh, like some of these items are going to take hours of my time. Right. So then planning out and dripping in different pieces of what could be a quite overwhelming checklist. What if you did that for yourself and, set up your future self by not planning to do it all in one day in a blast that's unlikely to happen, but like maybe one item every other week, slowly chip away at it, and you'll eventually get there. I actually just did this. It's not technically transition planning, but I finally applied for hospital privileges at the hospital that's in the same town that I work. Not because I'm going to work there directly, but you need hospital privileges to order like blood transfusions and iron infusions. And for the past 10 years, I've just had to ask one of my coworkers to co-sign my orders like I'm still a resident, because every time I would look at the checklist, I think it's the same as most other hospitals. It involved a police check. It involved updating my CV. It involved asking people to be references. It involved updating my immunizations. And like, I'm kind of complaining, as I said, I was like, this is too many things. And so I would like look at the list in the past and then I'd be like, ugh, never mind. But this time I was like, I'm doing this. I'm more than 10 years into practice. I want to sign my own transfusion orders. So It took me a couple of months. I'd put one little item on my calendar and I'd see how long it took to do the police check, see how long it took to do the CV. I didn't give up. I just did one little bit at a time. I strongly recommend a similar approach when you're working through usually very unpleasant and boring tasks related to transitions of any kind. The example I can give that is related to a transition is like for my mat leaves, right? So there's a Canadian physician mom Facebook group. There's a bunch of them actually, and searching those and getting all the information of advice of not just like, I don't know, what cradle to buy, but also like what paperwork was needed, and looking for those checklists and checking them off one thing at a time, because it felt so overwhelming when you're also like growing a new human and still working. So I think there were times where I ended up being late on something or missed a step. And I think about how if I'd sort of had a dedicated space of time to just look at one little bit of it one at a time in a more organized way, maybe I still would have missed something. It's possible, but I think I would have felt better about how I approached it if I really sort of chipped away at it in a more systematic fashion. Chaos is also fun though. So if you are, what do my sisters say? Chaos Muppet? I don't know. I never heard that term before. And you just want to attack it all at once. Like what works for you and your brain and your energy and your capacity? I honor all the ways. Another thing I learned, sort of speaking of transitions of clinical care, was for my second mat leave, I ended up stopping in-person care early because it was, the spring of 2020 and we weren't sure of the risks. And in a conversation with myself and my FMOB, made the decision that after, I think it was like 32 weeks or something, I was not going to see patients in person anymore. And luckily, my fabulous locum was available. And so she started working just part-time for me to see people in person. So I was working part-time and she was working part-time within my clinic, and I was doing virtual and she's doing in person. That was like so helpful. I could have done purely virtual and that would have been fine, but it was nice to have the option to do both. It also gave me more time to like rest and, gradually transition, sort of like, you're going through withdrawal if you suddenly stop working one day. So it's such a lovely way to just gradually titrate down the amount of work you're doing. And then you kind of are more prepared for stopping working altogether. And then I liked it so much that actually when I went back to work, she continued to work for me. I think it was 1 day a week. That definitely helped because I had taken on so much, like I said, with the vaccine clinic and stuff. And I just was able to ease myself back into working again. It felt so good. I think then I kind of forgot that for a few years, but now that I have the nurse practitioner working with me, I love having someone else also covering my practice. I strongly recommend testing that out. Again, even if you're not planning to retire for decades, there's something neat about practicing sharing your practice and all of the mindset work that you have to undo and all the inhuman stories that can get in the way of that. Those are worth leaving anyway. And then you have this sense of always having mutual support with this work that's hard, right? So certainly whenever I retire, I really hope and plan to have a similar thing where hopefully I can share and locum with whomever is taking over my practice for some time and gradually sort of titrate out. My dad definitely did that. For a while, the person who took over from him was his locum, and then they switched, and then he was a locum for his own practice, and then the other guy was taken over. There's something really lovely when we're able to do that gradually. And so something to consider as a part of the logistics of how could you make that work? How would you make that work financially? How would it work financially for the other person? Sometimes we think we can't do things, but if we just ask ourselves, how could we do it, and think through the logistics of it, there is a way. And then you see if it's the worth it way for you, right? So that's just some thoughts about logistics. The third principle for transition planning is the emotional, spiritual identity piece. So just knowing that grief is an inevitable part of transition. Even if you've done some of this work ahead of time and you've sort of de-identified from the role, I will absolutely feel a sense of grief, I imagine, when I leave my practice, just because it has still been I'm getting slightly emotional thinking about it, just because it's been such an important and wonderful place in my life, especially now that I love it so much. And I can have stress, sure, and there's days you get overwhelmed, but overall, it's such a meaningful place where I spend time and connect with people and offer people help, but also it's so bi-directional, and I'm going to miss my patients. I'm going to miss the people I'm working with, even though probably by that point, like everyone will be different because a bunch of people are going to retire in the meantime. It still will feel like a loss to leave, even if it feels right. I can think of how, like right now, leaving the teaching role I'm going to leave, I'm already feeling anticipatory grief, even though I'm not in it, of like, oh, that's the last time I'll do that talk. Though that might not be true, but oh, in a few short months, this is my last group. I'm looking at this group and I feel like I'm giving like maybe too much intense wisdom because I'm like, this is my last shot. This is my last group I can overshare my wisdom with, whether they want it or not. And I feel like I'm showing up through the lens of anticipatory grief because I'm like, oh man, this is an amazing part of this curriculum. I love it so much, and so that's okay and to be expected. Something that had goodness in it is going away. Also, feelings of anticipation and excitement and relief at transitioning onto something new, whether that new thing is having a baby, whether that new thing is taking on a new job or retiring, that will likely also be in play in some way. And especially if you're intentionally choosing a transition to something that you think will be like a better fit for you, or that you're ready for, that your body needs, whatever the case may be. So you may feel like excitement, relief, anticipation, and then you might feel socialized guilt or shame about it, being like, you're not, you're supposed to just be sad, right? So just knowing you're going to feel all of the feelings, just like anything will make you feel all the feelings. But I think especially in a time where you're like, the thing that's going to occupy your mind and your body for many of your waking hours is suddenly going to shift and be different. Even if it's gradually, your body is going to be emitting a lot of signals saying like, are we okay? Why is this different? Change is happening. Is this okay? Am I safe? Like, expecting emotion to arise is wise. And beyond that, especially if you have identified yourself with your work, which even if you work to undo, I think some amount is likely inevitable. Many people have a mild, moderate to severe identity crisis. Like, I don't know if you've seen this, but certainly in my practice, I can think of patients where they retired from a very intense, what they would probably call stressful, all-encompassing, hardworking job. They retire and then they come back to me within a year feeling, and they say they're so excited and relieved to finally be done. This is what they've been working for their whole life, to finally relax. And within a year, they come back to me and they've had a heart attack, or they have a deep depression because so much of their identity was actually attached, and their meaning and their sense of self-worth was attached to this work, right? And so whether it's that intense for you, I'm posing the hypothesis that if you do this kind of transition working, it will not be so severe for you. And even if it's not that severe, some amount of like, who am I now? What else am I beyond this role I've been holding is totally natural and something to expect. And the main thing is that all of that's going to take energy, is going to take time. And especially if you're like trying to process the grief of it while also trying to maintain actually a higher than normal workload, because you're trying to cram in all the transition logistical activities alongside all of your clinical activities. Like, if there's not space in order to plan this, it's going to come out sideways at people and at yourself and at other people. It's probably not going to feel that good. So useful to actually know and plan for it. Plan for the feelings. Do you have a like half day that you block just to cry about it? I don't know. What will you need? An extra break in the middle of your day. Plan to have your lunch out on a walk in nature so you can, feel all your feelings. I don't know. Like, that kind of thing may be wise to consider as you consider your transition. There's also there's a way in which I'm talking about it where it all seems like, oh, it's going to be so hard and energy draining to feel these feelings. But there's also a huge invitation in there. Transitions are a very important invitation, whether we take them or not, to really like re-examine and uncover and decide what actually matters to you, what's true about you, irrespective of what you do in the world, what's true about the world, and what your impact you want to have on it. Like, this is also can be a real crystallizing, crucible kind of time to burn away what actually didn't matter, all the things you used to stress about that literally aren't going to be your problem anymore. What's left? And like, especially if you can approach it from a place of discovery and invitation to come back home to yourself, it can be really beautiful. I absolutely experienced that with both of my maternity leaves. And even that sabbatical I took a couple of summers ago, which was like a month away transition, but like experiencing who you are outside of your work can be really profound as well. So it's nothing to be too afraid of. It just, we'll also have some feelings. We love feelings here. We're okay with feelings. The fourth thing, which is the thing that no matter what, whether you have no transitions planned, whether you decide I'm not doing any of that logistical work or knowledge transfer work, that all sounds like too intense and whatever, you're not interested in feelings. Practicing being your future self as much as you can now. That's that fourth principle is practice. Practice transition planning every day. Practice how it is that you would show up as your future self for your replacement self each day now. It will absolutely make that transition less jarring. So including like asking yourself, what am I going to miss most about this job? And how can I still connect with a version of that when I'm gone? So like this teaching role that I'm sad to leave, but one thing that's absolutely made it so much easier to consider leaving is that I know I'm not leaving teaching as a whole, and I'm leaving this kind of teaching role, sure, but I already have peppered in and actually up titrated so much other teaching I do in my life because I've realized like I love teaching. I love teaching so much. So now I actually have like a full-time family medicine resident who like I'm their primary preceptor for, so they're in my clinic. So like clinical teaching, I'm in fact doing more of, and that feels so fun. And then, hello, this podcast, this entire project of restorative medical education is teaching and teaching about what I love most and on my schedule. And in some ways, it's a version of what that curriculum is that's even gets to be more me feeling and authentic to me. And I really, really love it. So though I'm still sad to leave that behind, I have already, had my Suboxone replacement for the morphine I'm coming off of, if you know what I mean by that. So it's like, what's the, this having something rich that still fulfills those same parts of me moving forward absolutely helps you let go of what's been before, right? Because what you love will never be contained in one job, one person, if we're talking about transitioning between relationships, one setting, if we're talking about transitioning cities, or, if you're moving, there will be things that are unique to that person or job or place. Yes. And you can still notice the ways in which that workplace, that job, that role, that person, that place made you feel, and understand that in between that thing and how you're feeling is your perception of it, how you thought of yourself in it, and like how much of that can you bring with you? How can you replicate that in the next thing, right? And so practicing really being tuned into what you enjoy most and practicing finding what you enjoy most in across many settings can really help the transition. The other way, specifically for transitioning to retirement, where at some future point, whether it's fully my choice retirement or it's, medical retirement, like where my body says, hey, we have to not be doing income generating work anymore, like whatever happens in the future, I think I will be better prepared because I spend a lot of time not working now, and even when I'm working, finding pleasure and rest and having intentional unfilled time off and really having a spacious life now. I think it then in the future, and I guess I'll let you know in whenever it happens, but my hypothesis is because a lot of how I feel now feels like it feels like work, of course, but it's like spacious, vacation-y, enjoyable work. When in the work part is gone, I won't be totally shocked at the notion of nothing to do. Nothing to do doesn't scare me anymore. I enjoy having nothing to do as well as having something to do. And so I can continue to do that once I'm retired. And I think that the practice has now helped me with that. So all of that to say, when you think of all of those principles, like going through a transition is like taking on another part-time job. If you really were to create the space that probably your mind, body, and life and schedule and team needs to help you really like smoothishly transition and effectively transition in a way that feels good for everyone, it's going to be like taking on a part-time job, which means you'll have to well, you won't have to. But the invitation is to create space to allow yourself to do that, right? And I love creating space. How many times have I even said it this podcast, much less this episode, much less like on my podcast as a whole. So if that's work you're interested in doing with me, you can go to the Creating Space page on my website and watch the webinar, start practicing creating space. You can sign up for the coaching program if that's of interest to you. And know that it's worthwhile doing. So it's the flip, right? So like sometimes people want to focus on feeling better now, and that's their motivation to create space. And I love that. Some people find it just too hard because their socialization says it's bad to feel good now. So what if you did it more as an exercise to prepare for the future, and that feels more responsible or more helpful or something, right? Whatever motivation gets you there, I invite you to take it and run with it. So with that, 3 reflection questions that I'm leaving with you at the end of this podcast. Number 1, what transitions are you going through currently? I mean, just as a globe, as different like leaders of countries transition, like there's a transition is always happening. Change is always happening. And so some of this can actually be applicable, whether it's happening to you or on your own terms, right? What transitions can you see coming in the near future? And what's one way you can start preparing for one of those transitions this week? Just one thing you could do that's about preparing for helping your future self transition more smoothly, and whoever's helping you transition or replacing you have their transition in be more smoothly. What's one thing only that you could do this week and start doing and practicing now? And then once that's under your belt, keep going from there as much as you like. All right. Well, happy transitioning, everyone. And I'll talk to you next week. Bye. I would love to take this work deeper with you. Visit joanchanmd.com today and discover my growing menu of options for restorative medical education to suit your learning needs. I offer one-on-one coaching, customized workshops, and self-study courses that allow you to connect not only with my work on a deeper level, but also with other healthcare humans just like you. So if you want to start humanizing your work in healthcare to a deeper level and do it in community with others, please visit joanchanmd.com and find those options and what fits you and your life today.